of the Exodus narrative. One of them is Exodus chapter 12, and the other one is Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 12 has everything to do with Passover, so we're going to look at it because it's Passover. I'm not ready, but it's Passover. Although, I think we should just use the Seder that happened last night, and that should exempt us from the next week. You know, the best thing about doing a Passover Seder is doing it not on Passover.
Yeah, the rules are
What do you do?
Huh?
Second Passover.
You're talking about Pesach Sheni, when it's over?
Yeah.
Which actually is a very interesting concept. There's a, I don't know if you know this, but there's a little known holiday called Pesach Sheni, which is the second Passover. It's actually described in the Torah. And it takes place about a month or so after Passover. And it was for anyone who missed the opportunity to offer the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering. Because that's actually the obligation that you have on Passover itself, and we're going to look at that this morning. And so on the off chance, for whatever reason, you missed Passover, don't worry, you can do it again. But here's the coolest part about doing it again. No, after that. What's the coolest part about doing it again? It's only one day. You don't have to clean your house. And you can eat bread. All you need to do essentially is offer the Passover offering, right, and eat the maror or whatever. So it's
Only for people who were ritually impure.
Correct. People, for whatever reason, they couldn't participate in the first one.
Has this sprung a new movement to create Yom Kippur Sheni?
Which you
Like the day after?
all right.
Everybody's fine. My
There's a debate in Jewish tradition about what is the beginning of the Torah. Forget authorship for a moment, but what is the beginning of the Torah? So, what are the two possible answers? Bereshit, Genesis 1, but more specifically, Exodus chapter 12. Okay? And the reason why is because, and it's connected to what Barbara said, a lot of people think that the first part of the Torah, the book of Bereshit, and even the chapters leading up to the Exodus, were really just about getting us to the Exodus. Because what major transition happens in the Exodus? We become a people. But more than we become a people, let's think about it from the P tradition for a moment.
We have been given laws.
Being given the laws, what happens?
We have to form a covenant and obey them.
Exactly. We form a covenant with God.
As a people.
Correct, as a people. Which God? Adonai. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Tetragrammaton, Yahweh,
The God of Israel.
whatever other names God has. Although I found out yesterday, apparently in the election, God's Facebook profile was hacked. Have you ever seen the Facebook profile of Adam and Eve? Or of Cain and Abel?
Why is that a surprise? You know, Facebook is centered on, headquartered on one hacker way.
Yeah, of course. If you haven't seen it, Google. I'm pretty sure it's the Facebook page of either Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel. It's a whole long spoof about the beginning creation. I'll try to. So the reason why people say that the Torah begins at chapter 12 of Exodus is because of the opening lines. Lou, since you're back, will you read for us? I'm going to be in the Torah for a moment, but you can also open to page 138 in the Friedman, or page 380 in the red. But we're going to start in the red for a moment, because I want to look at some of the
Anybody want to read the first? Do we know what page are we on?
380.
380. Okay. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you."
Okay, so before we do anything, based on what we learned last time, if you were reading this text, specifically verse 1, what author would you think this text was written by? Why?
Because it's Moses and Aaron.
Good. It's Moses and Aaron. And one of the things we talked about last time is that there was a need for the priests to be able to reinsert Aaron at the forefront of the tradition. Why? Why was Moses not enough? Say it again?
They descended.
Good, they descended from Aaron, and
Aaron was the first official priest.
Aaron was the first official priest, and we want to make sure that ultimately at the end of the day, we know Moses was a great leader, but the person we need to link back to was Aaron. How did Aaron fit into the story? Into the Exodus story. What was his role?
He had to go and Moses there.
Good. He was the spokesperson for Moses. He went in front of Pharaoh. Almost half of the time that the plagues are introduced, he's the doing the talking. And one of the ways that we were able to identify that, if you were to go back and look at chapters 7, 8, and 9 in Exodus, was we saw the back and forth between P and E. Every time there was P, the priestly tradition, it was Moses and Aaron speaking, as opposed to just Moses. So the priests always want, as authors, they always want to make sure that we remember that Aaron has a pivotal role to play. Okay, so good, this is a P tradition. And it says, Lou, in verse 2, what's happening?
Verse 2, this is the new year.
This is the new year. Now in Jewish tradition, we don't have one new year. How many do we have? We have 4. Does anyone remember what they are?
Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah, which is in Tishrei.
First of Nisan.
First of Nisan, which we just celebrated this past week, which marks the Exodus.
Would it be Shavuot?
No, not Shavuot. Yes, Shvat, which is for the trees. And there's a debate as to whether or not it's on the 1st or the 15th. If it was like everything else, it should be on the 1st, but Hillel says it's on the 15th. And what's the last one? Elul, which was the month that we tithed. Specifically tithe the flock. It's the month that precedes Rosh Hashanah. We need to know how much cattle we have because we're going to offer a lot of bowl during Rosh Hashanah. Okay?
Which is the one where the king's years are counted?
Nisan.
Nisan is with
According to Jewish tradition, the Jewish calendar begins on which Rosh Chodesh?
Rosh Hashanah.
No,
Nisan.
Nisan.
Nisan is the first
Yeah.
one. Rosh Hashanah is in the 9th.
Rosh Hashanah is the creation.
But that's when the year changes.
Year
Correct.
57.
The year changes on Rosh Hashanah, and it's the anniversary of when creation happened, 5,778 years ago, plus a couple of billion.
But it's called the 9th month.
What in the Torah it's called the 7th month.
7th
The 7th month, sure. That's right, because Nisan is number 1. So this is the 1st month, and this is the 7th month.
So why does the year change, doesn't change on the 1st month?
Great question.
Yeah.
That's what we want to figure out. According to the Torah, though, the reason why this month is significant is because it becomes the month of months to mark the beginning of something, namely what? The covenant, the Exodus, which would make sense because who is writing this text? The priests. Remember, the priests have an agenda. And so they want to make sure that we know when we count from. By the way, what's another reason why Nisan is the beginning of the calendar?
Is it because of
Yes, say it again, Marilyn.
Spring.
Spring. So what happens in the spring?
New growth. New growth.
It's the spring harvest. It's the spring harvest. Rosh Hashanah actually is not connected to a harvest at all. What are the 3 harvest festivals? Sukkot is the last one. Passover is the first one. And Shavuot. And each one marks a different agricultural cycle. So in some ways, it wasn't just because of the covenant. It served an agricultural significance too. This was the beginning of the spring harvest.
So my ignorance, is Rosh Hashanah, where is it mentioned in the Torah?
It's mentioned a couple of times.
And would it be by, if you look at who's referencing it, is it,
Let's take a look. So use your Friedman book for a moment. Turn to Leviticus.
Leviticus. Chapter.
You know what, I actually have to look at it. because I don't remember which chapter it
This is
is.
where they have the
Hold on, I'll tell you 1 second. Look at chapter... I think that's right. Yes, look at chapter 23.
Page 226.
226 and 227. These are all of the laws about the various holidays. Okay, so it starts first with Shabbat.
Yes.
6 days you should work, and on the 7th day you should rest. And then it goes to the appointed times, the moeds. All right, and we start with Passover, then counting the Omer, then Shavuot, then we have Rosh Hashanah, and you'll notice who is the author of 23, 24, 25? Why does that make sense? What book are we in? Leviticus, the P tradition. Okay, the other place that it's mentioned is at the end of, it's mentioned a couple times in Deuteronomy also, but at the end of the book of Numbers, chapter 29, I believe. Starting in chapter 28. Most of this is priestly, but if you look at 28 and 29,
Then our
it's actually all a redaction. It was reinserted. Chapter 28 and 29 are the maftir readings that we read on Rosh Chodesh, on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, on the holidays. It tells us the sacrificial offerings that were done on those holidays. And by the way, if you just look for a moment, go to Leviticus chapter 23. Page 227. Look in verse 23. Speak to the Israelite children, saying, in the 7th month,
That's Rosh
on
Hashanah.
the 1st day of the month, you shall have a ceasing.
on last.
You shall not do any work. You're going to do an offering to the Lord.
And
And then look at the next one.
it's Yom
On the
Kippur.
10th of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. So the Torah counts the days from Nisan. By the way, if you just look up, look at verse 4. Verse 4 on 226. These are Adonai's appointed times. Holy assembly you shall proclaim under appointed time. In the first month, on the 14th of the month, is Passover. So we're in the first month according to the Torah. So the priests are highlighting something special about this month, which is the moment when the covenant will begin. Okay, back to chapter 12 of Exodus, page 380. Lou, tell us how we're supposed to prepare for Passover. Oh, in this page it's 138. Let's read in the red book, in the red book.
We're in chapter
Chapter 12,
verse 3.
page 380, verse 3.
Speak to the whole community of Israel, and say that on the 10th of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, let him share one with a neighbor who dwells nearby, in proportion to the number of persons. You shall contribute for the lamb according to what each household will eat. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a yearling male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep watch over it until the 14th day of this month. And all the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs.
Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in any way with water, but roasted, head, legs, and entrails over the fire.
Anyone ever wonder why we have a roasted shank bone at the meal? Right? That's what it says to do.
You shall not leave any of it over until morning. If any of it is left until morning, you shall burn it.
That's why we all feel so sick at the end of the Seder. There's more specifically left over, okay?
This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to the Lord.
Could you imagine looking underneath the Seder table and seeing everyone's loins girded, wearing sandals, holding a staff, ready to go?
We got one hand.
So that.
Right.
I
But
figured
why weren't any of these though picked up and carried through tradition? Like we have a tradition on Yom Kippur not to wear leather. So we could certainly have a tradition of wearing sandals.
Totally, and actually people do.
Don't you hold the staff?
Some people actually wear either sandals or they'll wear no shoes, so wear a lot of, on Passover.
Really?
Now, part of,
Very well
They
known.
hold the staff.
part of the reason why it doesn't get picked up is because the Seder is actually derived from a different place. The Seder is not derived from here. It's from the Greeks and the Romans, it's from the symposiums. And it was at the symposiums that they actually reclined and dipped their food and all of those things. So there's a hybrid of the tradition based on what the Torah says and based on the influence of Hellenization. Okay,
So I had the tradition of roasting a lamb for many years, and
Yes.
then I was told by a Haredi friend that you're prohibited from roasting,
For
That's-
eating.
and that they boil, but this says the
No, you're
opposite.
supposed to roast it or
Right.
stew it of some sort. You are prohibited from eating it. That is correct. Does anyone know why?
Well, because it's the Lord?
Because there are parts of it that aren't kosher? Or it hasn't been slaughtered?
Because it says
The
it's
temple's been destroyed?
Because it's a sacrifice and the temple's been destroyed. We don't offer the Passover offering anymore. We just have a relic of it on the Seder plate.
Okay.
Speaking of which, why do we have a hard-boiled egg on the Seder plate? Or a roasted egg, actually, on the Seder plate?
because it's a tradition.
Because an egg is like Jews, the more you cook it, the harder it gets.
All right, so the egg is symbolic of Jews, because of spring, because it's tradition. So far, I haven't heard the correct answer.
Rebirth or
Fertility.
fertility?
All of the answers we're giving are answers that we typically give and ascribe
Is
to
it
it.
also sacrifice?
It is.
What? What'd you say?
It is also sacrifice. Every festival we offer what was called a chagiga offering, a celebratory offering. And so the egg is actually symbolic of that offering. But since we don't do those offerings, just like the Paschal Lamb, it just sits on the table for us to look at.
But was that offering historically an unborn animal?
No, it was a born animal.
Boneless, skinless chicken.
So either-
It was an Empire boneless skinless chicken. Trader Joe's. Right. Could you imagine the priest say, do me a favor, run to Trader Yossi's, get me this for your animal.
So can we eat the egg?
We don't eat the egg that's on the Seder plate.
Right.
And actually the egg on the Seder plate is technically not supposed to be hard boiled, it's supposed to be roasted. And so I always have this tradition of seeing an egg that was partially cracked and burned a little bit on my Seder table, on my plate. But then what would happen is right after we finished telling the story and doing the matzah and the maror and everything, then my mother or grandmother would come out with a bowl of hard-boiled eggs that everyone would use and dip in the salt water or do whatever.
That's what we did last
But it's separate and apart from that which is on the Seder plate.
Right.
But you
It's
don't
separate
eat
and
really anything for the maror and the parsley.
The maror, the parsley, the charoset,
Yeah.
that's right.
The rules of kashrut precede this or after?
Thereafter.
Okay, because we're talking about eating the head and there are parts that you're not supposed to eat.
You can technically eat the head of it.
Okay.
But they
I don't know
roast
what
it.
it tastes
But the
like.
hind quarter.
That's only for certain animals.
Right.
We're not supposed to eat
Cow.
it.
That's just starting.
That's
Exactly. All right, Lou, keep going.
Where are we? We're on 12 now?
We're on,
11.
no, 12.
12. For that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt, I the Lord. And the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be to you one of remembrance. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord throughout the ages. You shall celebrate it as an institution for all time. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the very first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. You shall celebrate a sacred occasion on the first day and a sacred occasion on the seventh day. No work at all shall be done on them. Only what every person is to eat, that alone may be prepared for you. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe this day throughout the ages as an institution for all time. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. No leaven shall be found in your houses for 7 days. For whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the community of Israel. whether he is a stranger or a citizen of the country. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your settlements, you shall eat unleavened bread.
Okay, we're gonna stop there. That's the end of the peace section.
They're pretty emphatic about that.
They're very emphatic about it. By the way, I'm convinced that it's one of the reasons why people take this one so seriously. Of all of the things in Jewish tradition, people will not eat bread.
Yeah.
on
Oh,
Passover.
by the way, did I tell you don't eat bread?
Right. I didn't get the memo, but just in case. Okay. What is going on in this story? We got a whole bunch of rules, a whole bunch of stuff that we're supposed to do, but ultimately, what's the purpose of this story? Remembrance, good. Jerry?
I think it's to disguise the fact that the Exodus never really happened. And they're trying to make this a big party so that people won't think about the Exodus, they'll be thinking about dinner.
Okay.
But this doesn't describe a Seder.
It does not describe a
It gives
Seder.
some
I
rules
think
about
I think it's
what
to
you-
relive the fact that they didn't eat leavened bread.
Okay, so maybe it's a way of reliving what they did, Bob?
To me, I've always wondered why the Israelites needed to smear blood on their doors
Yeah.
as a sign to the Lord, pass us over.
Yes.
The Lord should have known who was Hebrew, who was not.
Okay.
But then I think this is a way of involving the people themselves in the ritual and to reinforce the importance of what they're being taught.
Great. So I want to pick up on what you just said and what Jerry just said. On some level, I think that you're right, Jerry, that this is a distraction from something else, and it had nothing to do with leaving Egypt or not leaving Egypt. It has to do with refocusing the people's attention to something very specific, and I think it has to do with what you just described. So let's look at some of the symbolism of what we have here. So what are they supposed to take on the 10th day? A lamb. And then what are they supposed to do with the lamb on the 14th day? Slaughter it. And then what do they do with the lamb when they've slaughtered it?
Take the blood.
They do two things with it. One is they take the blood and they put it on the doorpost. And what's the other thing they do? They make dinner.
Yeah.
They make dinner. Now, why put blood on the doorpost? Who is the blood for? Maybe.
let each other know.
Maybe it's to let each other know.
Is it like the sacrifices in the temple where they would sprinkle the blood on the altar of the sacrificial animal?
And what was the purpose of doing the sprinkling of the blood on the altar?
That's a good question.
What does blood represent in the
Life
ancient
force.
world?
Life and death.
Death, and the warding off of evil.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes, I'll give you an example. Earlier in our story, in chapter 4, there's this weird encounter in the nighttime where Moses is on his way back, and Zipporah and Eliezer are accosted by this angel of death who tries to kill the baby. And so what does Zipporah do in that moment?
She circumcised
She
her.
circumcises and uses the blood to ward off evil. Blood in the ancient world was used as a way of getting rid of the spirits of death.
So this was for the angel of death.
That's correct, right? If you put the blood on the doorpost, it was seen as an omen, or like a way, or an antidote, if you will, to this fear that the angel was going to come and do something.
As if God doesn't control the angel of death.
Well, that's what's an interesting question. Who was the blood for? Was it really for God, or was it for the people? Is the act of going through Passover, of preparing the meal, because God knows we spend an inordinate amount of time getting ready for the Seder. We clean, we cook, we shop, we spend all kinds of money on it. We buy things that only have specific labels in ways that we never would for the rest of the year. Is it for God or is it for us? When we sit around the table and we tell the story, we do all of our traditions and we sing all of our songs, is it for God or is it for us?
Us.
And who in particular is it for? It's not just for us, but it's for the children, for the next generation. We use meals, if you will, as a way of preparing or teaching and getting ready for some sharing of story.
Because in here it says to eat fast.
They
And
do.
we do nothing close to eating fast.
That's not true. Depends what Seder you're at. Some Seders we can't eat fast enough. Or we can't get through the Seder fast enough in order to be able to eat.
Maybe a way of cleansing the past.
Yes, it could be a way of atoning for something or getting rid of something. It was also a form of entering covenant. Blood is a form of covenantal of entering covenant. Why do we circumcise?
That's the mark of the covenant.
It's the mark of the covenant. And interestingly, if you look, there's a couple of references to this. Look in verse 15, and then look at again in verse 19. In 12. In 12. If I want to say in Hebrew that I'm entering a covenant, I say the word koret brit. Koret is to enact a covenant. But what happens if I don't enter the covenant? Look in verse 16, verse 15. If I don't eat unleavened stuff, if I don't eat matzah, what happens to me? V'nichreta hanefesh ahi miYisrael. My soul is literally uncut, unconnected, disconnected from the tradition, from the Israelites.
It's a pretty severe penalty.
It's a very severe penalty. If you disobey this covenant that we are entering into, I'm going to undo the covenant with you. You specifically, you, your family, and you will be disconnected.
Why is this so important?
It's a great question. Let's think about it through the lens of who wrote it. Why would the priest be so emphatic about wanting to highlight the importance of being connected to the covenant?
Well, it seems that when you bring offerings to the temple, which is what the priest said, I mean, they're the ones acting. But here, it's sort of pushing it down to people to do
Yes.
some sort of, in a sense, a sacrifice, which is very different from how the sacrificial
I love
life was going.
Right? This is one of those examples where we're taking the power of the priest out of the hands of the priest and giving it to the people. Who is responsible for preparing Passover? We are. Who is responsible for putting the blood on the doorpost?
We are.
Who is responsible for making the meal, which includes the lamb? We are. We're taking the perfection, the responsibility, the resume, if you will, that belonged to the priest, and we're saying, let's have the people do it.
But not only let the people do it, if you don't do it, you're going to be cut off. So it's sort of a...
It's more than that. Not only if you don't do it, but if you don't do it right.
Right.
If you eat any of it the next morning, if you leave any of it behind, if you don't slaughter it in this way, if you don't prepare the meal in a roasted fashion, kind of like if you follow a recipe. Anyone here bake? There's a major difference between baking, like desserts and things like that, and cooking. What's the major difference?
Well, bacon's chemistry.
Chemistry, it's precision, right? If you don't measure the right amount of water, the right amount of sugar, I remember one time I was making my mother's pumpkin bread in college. And I did it, and I mixed all of the ingredients in the bowl, and then I did it, and it flopped. And my mom asked me, did you put the wet ingredients separate from the dry ingredients? And I said, that matters. Of course it does. I didn't know that, but apparently it matters. So there's a very specific order. And in some way, Jerry's right. The intention around the creation of the meal and what happens around it, the rituals of it, may be more important than the covenant or anything else, or if it even happened. Think about how much attention we give to making sure the Seder happens right, and specifically to telling the story.
I think also this was like a new beginning for the Jewish people.
Yeah.
They were starting all over again as becoming Jews because they were slaves before.
Yeah.
And so this was so important because Judaism was having a rebirth in a way.
Yep. And if we're going to start over, we might as well start over correctly.
Was there
Wait, Lou and Barbara?
You said something about how it's slaughtered. It doesn't talk about how it's slaughtered here.
Well,
Unless I missed something. Going back to 6, the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight.
yeah, so that's the issue.
That's it, okay, but there's no...
No, it's
Like I
presumed
said-
that it would be a ritual slaughtering of kosher status, it was a kosher animal and that kind of thing. But
Okay, but I thought we could get those till later.
it depends on authorship.
Okay.
Okay, if we're saying that this was written by the priests, they already knew how to slaughter it. And not only how to slaughter it, but what the right order is to eat it and to make it. By the way, you can't take the lamb on the 10th day and slaughter it on the 10th day.
No, that's what it said, 14.
It has to be done right before the moment. By the way, twilight is a very interesting time in Jewish tradition. What's twilight mean?
Pre-evening. Shalom.
Yes, pre-evening, which means what, Lou?
Between sundown and sunset.
Okay, in Shabbat, in the world of Shabbat, we call that Bein Hashmashot, between the suns. So between the sun and the moon. So what does that mean, practically speaking, in terms of timing?
Transition from one day to the next.
That's correct, which means it's technically not the previous day, but it's technically not the next day.
The
There was-
20-minute period?
It's the 18-minute period, if you look.
Grace period.
It's more than a grace period, it's a period of uncertainty. We don't know yet which day it is, and so we create a fence around it to make sure that we don't violate Shabbat.
So,
Or, if we needed a little bit of extra time to make sure that we can bring Shabbat in correctly, better to violate it in that time, when it's maybe not technically a violation, and then start Shabbat.
all right, so would you be roasting it, like if it, on Shabbat, you light the candles 18 minutes before sundown,
No, it's actually before sunset.
sunset? Okay. Well then, would you be roasting it?
Shabbat starts at sunset,
Right.
but ends at sundown.
Okay. Would you be roasting in that 18-minute window?
Well, probably just before we'd be
Okay.
finishing it. I remember growing up, I think I got this from my grandfather. He used to throw the shank bone into the oven, like right before we would sit down for the Seder. I'm sure that came out of some Eastern European tradition that was probably connected to this, but that's what it was.
So is there anywhere, any provision that if someone did violate and got cut off, they could redeem themselves? People make mistakes.
Yes.
There is a way to redeem yourself?
Yeah, but there's also not so much evidence that they did it with regard to this, but there is a story later on, I believe, if I remember correctly, that talks about people not observing it and they were cut off. But also that,
They could come
there's,
back.
Would you redeem yourself at Yom Kippur?
you could. But that's why there's also Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, in case you missed it or whatever you could do, right?
So, considering that this is supposedly written by the priests, and we just said it moves power from the priests to the people, the question arises, why did the priests write this then?
Good question.
By giving the people some responsibility, and by giving them a, but if you don't, the priests
Sounds like a
were-
parenting manual.
Yeah, exactly. The priests were trying to ensure that their flock would stay with them.
Right.
Giving them the responsibilities, but again, giving them the caveats. To be cynical about it, it's just they wanted bigger groups of people following them.
Right, and I think you're right. What were you going to say?
I think this is all about, I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt. It's about a deconstruction of the pagan, and the idea that blood and the angel of death passes over, and that your progeny could be destroyed by our God if you're displeasing to him.
Yeah.
It's all a threat to
Yeah, and
pagans.
if you look for a moment, if you look at verse 12 on page 383, this is the language we have reminiscent in the Haggadah. For that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land, both man and beast. I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt, I the Lord, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And the blood of the houses where you are staying will be a sign for you. Sign, an oath, is a very common word used to talk about covenant. And pass over and strike the land. This is kind of the moment in the Haggadah where we talk about who does the Exodus. It is I, the Lord. I am not an angel. I am not a seraph. I am not whatever. And it's about affirming God's supremacy in the story. God, the Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, is more powerful than the other.
Although it's a very strange verse, because here Yahweh is saying, I will punish the gods of Egypt, so he acknowledges their existence and that he's going to banish them.
Well, that's one way to read it. Another way to read it is it's the priests who are saying,
Right.
it is our God overpowering their gods.
So they
or their gods don't really exist, and so we want to clarify for you who is God.
So they're threatening the pagan priests. That makes
Or
a
the
lot of
followers of the false gods.
Yeah.
When
Oh wait, finish that.
I'm surprised that we kind of skipped over
Oh, we skipped over a lot. We passed over a lot.
I get it.
verse 17, because a comment was made,
Which verse?
verse 17,
The issue of, on this very day, I brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt.
Yeah.
That theme is a critical theme in all of Jewish ritual.
Yep.
Yes.
And rather than demote the significance of the Exodus, someone suggested that maybe this was a you just said all this denied the existence of the Exodus. It's the Exodus that's the central historical point of the Jewish people.
Right.
And you know, we acknowledge that in the Kiddush.
That's right.
Over and over again.
And in some ways, I think you're right, that independent of if it happened or not, this tradition, more than any other tradition, transcends time. It's supposed to exist forever. It's probably the most widely celebrated holiday other than Hanukkah in the Jewish world. And the story we still tell today. And even if it did happen, we tell it the way that the Torah tells it. And even if it didn't happen, we still tell it that way. Plus, we use modern day interpretation as a way of ascribing the relationship between this Exodus and every other kind of Exodus that still needs to happen, where there is oppression and subjugation in the world.
And if you talk about birth of the Jewish people, the symbolism of the people being born out of the water as they cross
The sea.
I mean, it's just like birth, when you come out of the womb and there's a lot of water around.
Yeah.
This is the birth of the Jewish people.
Right.
And we have to keep remembering that, reminding ourselves of this, and this is why it's such a big deal to do this ritual in a prescribed way.
And it's one of the reasons why the commentaries link this to being the beginning of the Torah, in terms of when the relationship, the rebirth, if you will, begins, as opposed to Genesis.
When Moses and Aaron transmit this information to the Israelites, could there have been some Egyptian hangers-on who wanted to jump on the bandwagon and say, hey, I'm going to spread some blood on my lintel? And, you know, because they don't want the firstborn of their families.
Right. By the way, there's a little quid pro quo happening here. Why do we think the 10th plague is the killing of the firstborn son?
As opposed to the first?
It doesn't say son, it just says
the firstborn.
Yeah.
You're right.
Interesting.
What's the question?
Why is the last plague? Why is this whole thing happening? Why are we ending with the killing of the firstborn?
Because it's the saddest.
That is true, it's the saddest.
If this doesn't wake him up, nothing will.
Say again?
It strikes right at Pharaoh's family.
Okay, it strikes right at Pharaoh's family.
Does this have anything to do with God saying that the firstborn belong to me?
Well, that's what the story will move to, right? That the firstborn will ultimately become his. And what do you have to do to a firstborn child? You have to redeem them from the Kohen, from the priests. Because their life is supposed to be dedicated to service to the priest or to the temple. Why else?
50 shepherds.
Osiris?
Huh?
Osiris, the Egyptian god of death. The two high gods were Ra, light.
Right.
So the first act was to blot the sun out from the sky, and the last one is the second biggest one, which is Osiris, which is death.
Right. Or
So
the firstborn.
to demote their...
So it's a way of
Egyptian-
demoting gods.
their gods.
It could also be emblematic of the place where we started, which was to kill the firstborn sons, or to throw all the sons in the Nile. So there's a full circle, if you will, what we would call a measure for measure, midah keneged midah kind of thing.
Can I jump in on one thing? So, what you were just saying about the Exodus being the most important thing, it's interesting because I think it's 180. I think it's 180 backwards. I think the most important thing was the coming of Yahweh, and that there was a pairing of Yahweh and the outstretched hand in Exodus to try to kind of sell is not the right word, but to kind of show us the beneficence of the God of Israel, Yahweh, towards the people of Israel.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because that was the second text I wanted to look at.
Okay.
Look at chapter 15 of Exodus, page 406 and page 144. Hopefully you all know this one. And the reason I want to look at this is because all of the chapters in between 406 are some combination of back and forth authorship. But chapter 15 is the Song of the Sea. It's on page 144 in the Friedman, page 406 in chapter 15. Before you look at the text for a moment, if I were to ask you what the Song of the Sea is about, what would you say?
Praising God.
Praising God?
It's a celebration.
Celebration? When does it happen?
Pharaoh's chariots are driven into the sea.
Right, so after they wade through the sea, they make it to dry ground, the sea essentially comes back together on top of the Egyptians, and either all of them are obliterated or all but one are obliterated. That's for another time. And we have this joyous, jubilant singing that was led by Moses and Miriam, and the people played some role in it. Many of you know the song Ozi v'zimrat yah, vayihili lishua.
Here it is.
It's right there, verse 2. You also know in verse 11, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedaber kodesh. You also know verse 18, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. Interestingly, for those of you who have been singing these for years and years and years, look at the name of God in all of them. They're all talking about Adonai. Even verse 2. Verse 2 says, Ozi v'zimrat yah. The Yud-Hey from the Vav-Hey, Yud-Hey of the Vav-Hey, Yud-Hey, whatever it is. There's that one. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, and Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. This is a story that declares Yud-Hey Vav-Hey's reign as supreme. We have finally left Egypt. We have finally destroyed Pharaoh. We have finally destroyed all of the other gods. And now, for the first time, we get to openly declare God's name as Yud-Hey Vav-Hey. Where do we first see in the Exodus story that Yud-Hey Vav-Hey is actually God's name? Moses. It's even after the burning bush, right? Again in chapter 6, God says, my ancestors knew me by this name. They knew me by El Shaddai. They did know me by Adonai, but my name is Yud-Hey Vav-Hey. And so the Song of the Sea, if you will, is the bookend to the story. Why did they get taken out of Egypt? Because they wanted to come to know who their God was. And look at who the author is of chapter 15. J.
Isn't the Song of the Sea thought to be some of the oldest?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is the oldest song.
It is among the oldest pieces of text in the Torah. Right? And if you want to look, look at Friedman's note on the bottom of 144. I guess it doesn't matter, so it's not such a... It says, this poem, known as the Song of the Sea, is an independent old composition, possibly the oldest composition in the Hebrew Bible. As in the case of the blessing of Jacob, the author of J both used it as a source of information and included it in his work. There was something very special from an early time period of an understanding of who God was to the people that they authored this text. And it probably was inserted, rightfully so, in a moment when the Israelites were finally free to determine who their relationship is with their God. Ultimately, Yahweh. There's a lot of other struggle along the way, but this becomes the pivotal moment. There's an interesting midrash, well, I should say it differently. How is the song chanted? With a what? A rock band. Nice. Kind of. Miriam had her timbrels and there were drums, so totally there was a rock band. How was it sang? Sung.
Minor?
I think what you're joyously.
now.
Joyously, with dancing.
Joyously. But who's singing?
Miriam.
There's a debate, actually, as to if it's Moses singing, if they're all singing it together, or if there was a call and response of some sort. And we actually, the way we chant it today is some combination of all of them. Some of them is just chanted by people, and some of it we all sing together, and some of it there's a call and a response kind of thing. And the argument to be made for those different pieces was that it wasn't enough for the song to be sung. It also needed to be something that people latched onto as a way of connecting themselves in their relationship to the God Yud Hey Vav Hey. Ripu?
So it says here, and Miriam chanted for them.
You're at the end.
Oh, this is the other part. Oh, sorry.
You're at the very end?
At the very end, sorry. I
Yeah.
thought in the beginning I saw a line, I was looking for it, that they all joined Miriam in singing. Isn't there a line like that? It's in the,
It's at the very end, verse
just before
20.
the end of 14.
End of 14?
And it says, Miriam led them in a
Yeah,
dance.
it's like 20.
Oh, the end of chapter 14.
Yes,
Yeah.
20.
I don't know that part, but at the end of chapter 15 it's there.
Yeah, at the end of it. Aaron's on 20.
Here's Moses and the children of Israel saying.
In verse 20, it said, in chapter 15, verse 20, it says, and Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister,
Right.
took a drum in her hand, and all the women went out behind her with drums and with
And
dances.
she chanted for them.
And she sang to them, sing to Adonai, for he triumphed. Horse and its rider he cast into the sea.
But that's only that little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this particular verse is Moses' role.
15, very first line up. It's Moses and the Israelites sang this song to them.
That's right. The very beginning of
Very
chapter
beginning, that's what I was
15
thinking, very
is
beginning.
Moses.
Yeah,
The very end of 15 is Miriam.
Right.
By the way, how is Miriam defined?
Aaron's sister.
Not only as an Aaron's sister, but as a prophetess.
Prophetess.
She was a Neviah, she was a prophetess. Although in this case, look who the author is. E. And if you look down at his notes, he says Miriam was identified as Aaron's sister, but not as the sister of Moses. In E, Miriam and Aaron are not Moses' siblings.
Yeah.
Only in P. Now, think really hard about this one. How do we know that in our story?
Because Miriam took brother and put him in the mouth.
And when Miriam does that, what name is given to Miriam? She said that Miriam was the one who put him in the Nile. But in that story, Miriam is unnamed. It's not until later that we get the whole priestly lineage, right, where P reinserts and gives us in chapter 6 and tells us the whole family tree. When we first learned that story about Miriam and Moses in the basket, Miriam is unnamed, as is her mother.
The mother is unnamed also.
She was just called, we can go back and look. If you go back to the beginning of chapter 2
Yeah.
of Exodus, this is one of the interesting things I think about studying Torah, which is that in some places it seems overtly obvious the relationship, and in other places it seems ambiguous intentionally.
If the Egyptians were killing all the Israeli boys as were being born, why would the sisters
Wait, say it again?
Sister said that there was
if
God.
Egypt was killing the
Israeli boys, yeah.
Israeli boys as they're being born, why were there so many Israeli men?
Oh, that's a good question. So there's two reasons. One is that just because there was a decree doesn't mean they followed it. And that's the reason why we have the midwife story, as if to say that the midwives were actively playing a role in stopping the decree. And the reason why Pharaoh keeps getting mad is that the Israelites are too fruitful and multiplying too quickly in order to be able to combat his decree that he has sentenced them to death. So the Torah at least paints the picture that despite the decree, they either saved the boys or they were too fruitful and making too many more children faster than Pharaoh could kill them.
They were afraid
They
they'd
put
bring,
Moses in that little boat in order to save his life.
they were afraid they'd bring.
Could you imagine that? Moses was in like a little yacht.
So the priests filled in.
But if you look at chapter 2, we have no names for these people.
Right.
Who names Moses?
Pharaoh's daughter.
Pharaoh's daughter.
But the priests later feel the need to make sure that the woman who saved Moses is connected, related.
Why?
Well, they know she's Aaron's sister.
That's right. And if we
they
know
were
that she's
sent
Aaron,
from Aaron.
you got it.
So they want that,
You just put the whole thing
that
together.
aura of Moses.
Did everyone follow what Barbara just said? Did anyone not follow what Barbara just said? Say it
I
again.
couldn't hear it.
Oh.
hear it.
So the priests feel the need to make it clear or to decide that Miriam is Moses' sister, so that their whole line of descendants has this lineal connection to Moses that makes them better and holy.
Because otherwise you could think that Moses is some random guy over to the side. The priests want to link it all together because ultimately they want to make sure that we have Aaron as the direct descendant for the priest, but we need Moses' power and authority from the story, and so we connect them all. And so what they did in chapter 6 is they gave us, just in case you were worried, let me give you the lineage of the family so that you understand how Moses, Aaron, it's brilliant.
Well, I understand they felt that need, but if Aaron had been unrelated to Moses but had been selected or he stepped up to help him, that would have been just as good. He didn't have to
Correct.
be blood related to
Not
him. He
really.
did some good things.
But in chapter 4, God says that there is your brother Aaron the Levite.
Yes,
Yeah,
but that's an insertion.
yeah.
Oh,
From an authorship perspective, it's an insertion. If we're just studying it at face value, totally. The Torah is just making sure that we're clear.
Well, that doesn't say it's his brother. I mean, you're my Jewish sister. That doesn't mean you're my sister.
I'll leave that between you and your parents.
Yeah.
Definitely not your sister.
Why does this song always say the song of Miriam? When you see it in the beginning, it's Moses and the Israelites singing, and it's not to the very end that Miriam is even mentioned with that.
Correct.
Is there,
And by the way, if you look at Friedman, it's an insertion by a different author.
right, so you know why that kind of, it's kind of puzzling why it's
That's not
to
the
be known.
Miriam song, Cindy.
Yeah, it is.
Well, it's actually called Shirat Hayam. It's called the
Right.
Song of the
Song of the
Sea.
Sea.
See, but
So
It's not clear from the literal interpretation of the text if what the song was is what Miriam sang, or if Miriam sang something else afterward. Because if you look at the Hebrew, let's just look at the Hebrew for a second.
okay.
We've just finished the Song of the Sea. Looking at verse 19 for a moment, page 412. So the song is over. For the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and horsemen went into the sea, and the Lord turned back the waters of the sea. But the Israelites marched on dry ground in the midst of the sea. And then it says in verse 20, Vatikach Miriam HaNeviah, Achot Aharon et hatof biyada, Vatetzena chol hanashim acharea betupim uvimcholot. Vata'am lahem Miriam, shiru l'Adonai, ki ga'o ga'as, v'srofo aliyah. In biblical Hebrew, there are 3 consecutive verbs that happen. Vatikach Miriam means, and then, as if to say the song is over, and then Miriam took her drum in her hand. Vatetzena chol hanashim. Then all of the women went out.
And dance with it.
Betupim uvimcholot, with drums and with timbrels. Vata'am lahem Miriam, and they responded, or Vata'am literally means they answered, or they all answered together, sing a new song, for God triumphed. The verbiage would suggest that this is happening afterward.
Right.
The song was sung, and by the way, look at the very beginning of the song. The opening of the song says, Az Yashir Moshe Ubnei Yisrael et Hashira Hazot L'Adonai. Then Moses and the Israelites sang the song to Adonai. This song, it would seem to be, was sung by Moses.
And all the people.
And all of the people,
And
which
all the
includes
people.
Miriam and all the women.
Everybody.
But it seems like almost after the song, Miriam,
The song. And a new
maybe.
song.
Yes, that's
A
one
new song.
interpretation.
In English, I mean, in the English translation, it's the same song.
Right, so maybe they re-sang the song, or maybe
A
it
new
was
song.
a new song.
A new song. Sing a new song, she said.
It's kind of like the first round of Simon Tov and Mazel Tov. Right? Jerome starts the first round of Simon Tov and Mazel Tov, and then we start it again, and everyone joins in. But we don't really know how it was sung. We have different interpretations. It could have been it was the same song. It could have been a different song. It could have been that she repeated it.
She only
We don't know.
chanted these 2 lines.
And that's another interpretation. She only sings the lines, Shiru Ladonai Ki Ga'oga.
Yeah.
Well, they refer to Miriam as Aaron's sister, not Moses. In this section.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's for the reason that Barbara was talking about before, that there's a very clear understanding in the text that we know Miriam and Aaron were brother and sister, but it's not so clear how Moses fits in.
But Moses was raised as an Egyptian,
Correct.
Yeah, but they
But he
wanted
was born
us
to
to
a
think that Aaron is his
family.
brother.
but he was raised.
So that's
as
why
an Egyptian.
So why?
that's why the priestly tradition has inserted all these things, and in the other, the text from the other traditions don't have it.
That's right.
Can I be clear? So like, when you think about the Aliyah, right? There are 3 Aliyah for the Kohanim, the Levitical, and then the Israelite.
Right.
So we've carried this all the way to the modern times. The Levites weren't, there was a battle for who the priests would be, right? So there was Korah,
Korach,
and
Aaron.
so there were
3 brothers.
So there were battles for who would lead among the Levitical group to be the Kohanim. And that probably happened after the Exodus.
Right.
And,
But
but then you
which-
gotta go back through history and make sure you clean it up so that it supports who.
Korach was a cousin of Moses, but they all come from 3 brothers. So Moses, Aaron's, and Miriam's father Amram had 2 brothers, and they each had kids, and they're all the ones that are duking it.
So where are Moses and Aaron identified as brothers?
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6?
Yeah. Levitical brother.
Depends which tradition you read.
Because this seems to make it, this seems to imply that it's not clear.
Let me say it a different way. Everything I ever learned from the time I was a kid said that Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were brothers and sisters.
That's the.
Everything. I never ever heard it otherwise.
But this seems to,
Depends how you read
glaze
it.
over that.
If you read it critically, there's room for ambiguity. If you read it traditionally, the first one introduces these characters, and the second part of the story just clarifies it for you, because you might have thought it was Miriam, Aaron, and Moses. We just want to make sure. By the way, there is value in saying that the heroes of our story are both Moses, or 3, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and they all play a specific role. Were they actually siblings? I have no idea. Did it actually happen? I have no idea. Does it matter? I don't know. I don't know that it matters.
It matters because it unifies us, we all have the same story, same roots.
Sure.
So
And
even
that's,
though we look different, we all can trace our lineage back to the Exodus. Not that that means the Exodus happened, but our stories coincide.
and I'll go back to your point here that you made earlier. It's the reason why this story is supposed to be passed through the generations. We have made it, what independent of what it was, what we have made it into is what's important. It's become a symbol of everything that we stand for as a Jewish people in terms of how we relate to other people, how we tell our story, how we teach our children, how we create new rituals. It all derives from the Exodus. I think something happened. I don't know exactly what it was, but for me the power of the story is not so much in whether it did or didn't exist, but it's what we did with it when it was created, when it was written, or however it was told.
Aaron could have been his brother's 3rd child.
You know, we're all, brothers from another mother. So.
We know they were both
Or
Levites.
sisters from another what? Oh, from another mister.
We
Sure.
know they were both Levites,
Yes, we do know they were.
so they were related in some way.
We're going to stop here because I have to go to work because I have teacher conferences. So I apologize, I have to run out. We will have one more class next week to kind of get us ready for Passover. Are people willing to give an hour as opposed to clean? Okay. All right. By the way, I don't know if it was just my impression, but I kind of got the sense that there was a lot of interesting synergies happening in people's minds today about how some of the authorship pieces are working together.
Yeah.
Except for Jared.
If you eat bread during Passover,
Yes.
how do you get reinstated?
You're